The great plaza of Ashfall was a bowl of frozen stone, overflowing with the silent, bated breath of thousands. Above, the blood moon hung heavy and swollen, a celestial eye focused entirely on the obsidian dais where Alpha King Lucien Ashwolf stood. He was a vision of terrifying regal stillness, his broad shoulders draped in the pelt of a midnight frost bear, his golden eyes scanning the crowd with the predatory patience of a man who had already conquered the world and was now waiting for the stars to catch up. For centuries, the moon-gazing ceremony had been the heartbeat of the kingdom, the moment where the goddess reached down with a finger of light to knit two souls together. But tonight, the air tasted of ozone and ancient, bitter iron. Vesa Holomir stood at the very edge of the plaza, where the shadows of the silent graves district bled into the light of the nobility. She kept her head low, the rough wool of her cloak pulled tight to hide the tremor in her hands, not from fear of the king, but from the searing, forbidden heat pulsing beneath the skin of her collarbone. The void flame was restless. It clawed at her veins, a violet hunger that threatened to erupt and turn her into a charred cinder if she so much as drew a ragged breath. She just had to survive the night. If the light passed her over, she could vanish back into the soot and smoke of the slums, taking her family's secrets and her cursed mark with her. Then the moonstone at the center of the dais began to hum. A low vibrational thrum vibrated through the soles of Vesa's boots, climbing up her spine like a cold insect. The crowd gasped as a pillar of lunar light, pure and blinding as a diamond, tore through the crimson sky. It didn't drift toward the silken pavilions of the High Council's daughters. It didn't linger on the elegant she-wolves of the inner circle. Instead, it arced across the plaza like a falling star, striking Vesa with the force of a physical blow. The world went white. The bond snapped into place with the sound of a closing tomb, tethering her soul to the man on the dais. Vesa looked up, meeting Lucien's stunned golden gaze across the distance. She felt his strength, his loneliness, and his sudden, overwhelming possessiveness. But as the connection deepened, the void flame inside her shrieked in protest. The purple light began to leak through the pores of her skin, a heretical glow that would signal her execution within seconds. Desperation, sharp and cold, replaced her shock. As Lucien stepped down from the dais, his hand outstretched to claim the pariah the goddess had chosen, Vesa did the unthinkable. She didn't kneel. She didn't weep with joy. She stepped forward into the sacred circle, gathered the bitter moisture in her throat, and spat directly onto the shimmering surface of the moonstone. The sacred light hissed and recoiled. "I would rather be claimed by the dirt than by a king with blood on his hands," she rasped, her voice cutting through the silence like a serrated blade. "You are no mate of mine, Lucien Ashwolf. You are merely a tyrant wearing a stolen crown." The collective intake of breath from the nobility sounded like a death rattle. Lucien froze, his hand hovering in the air, his face darkening into a mask of lethal wounded pride. The shame was absolute. She had not just rejected him, she had defiled the very foundation of his rule before the eyes of his gods and his subjects. The king's golden eyes bled into a terrifying animalistic black. "You crave the dirt, little wolf?" Lucien's voice was a low, vibrating growl that promised no mercy. "Then I shall give you the wasteland. Guards, seize her." Chapter 1. The silence that followed Vesa's blasphemy was not merely a lack of sound. It was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the great plaza of Ashfall. The sacred moonstone, still wet with the moisture of her defiance, hissed as if the rock itself were screaming in agony. The silver light that had so triumphantly bound them together now flickered and grayed, recoiling from the sight of its desecration. Thousands of wolves stood paralyzed, their predatory instincts warring with the sheer impossible shock of what they had just witnessed. A girl from the silent graves, a nameless daughter of heresy, had not only rejected the Alpha King, she had insulted the goddess herself. Lucien Ashwolf did not move. To a casual observer he might have appeared carved from the same obsidian as the dais, but those closest to him saw the terrifying transformation. The golden warmth that usually simmered in his eyes, the heat of a just ruler, was extinguished, replaced by a void of absolute freezing black. His pulse, which had been racing with the intoxicating rush of the bond, went cold. The rejection felt like a silver blade being driven into his sternum and twisted, but it was the public shame, the calculated strike against his authority before every pack leader in the north, that turned his heartbreak into something much more dangerous. The high priestess was the first to break the silence, her voice a shrill, jagged glass shard. Sacrilege! The void has taken her. Look at her eyes, she shrieked, pointing a skeletal finger at Vesa. Vesa felt the heat beneath her collarbone intensify. The void flame was no longer just a pulse, it was a roar. The violet light was beginning to vein upward into her neck, visible to anyone who dared look closely. She had to provoke him further. She had to ensure he sent her away, far from the prying eyes of the temple and the holy fires that would surely detect her demon mark. If she died tonight in the wilderness, her family's secret died with her, but if she stayed here, they would all be burned as heretics. Look at your king, Vesa shouted, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the effort of containing the explosion in her chest. She stepped toward Lucien, defying the spears of the royal guard that leveled at her throat. He stands there draped in the skins of better men, waiting for a stone to tell him who to love because he has no heart of his own. I am a holomere. My blood is the earth and the soot of the graves. It will never mix with the ice in his veins. Lucien's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. The holomere name was a curse in this city, a reminder of the rebellion he had been forced to crush years ago. By invoking it, she wasn't just rejecting a marriage, she was reigniting a civil war. He stepped off the final stone of the dais, his boots crunching on the frost-dusted marble. He was a head taller than her, his presence an overwhelming storm of power and pheromones that tried to force her knees to the ground. The bond screamed at her to submit, to reach out and touch the man whose soul was meant to be the other half of her own, but Vesa bit her tongue until she tasted copper, using the pain to anchor her defiance. You speak of blood, Lucien said, his voice a low vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the teeth of everyone in the plaza. It was the sound of a predator that had finally stopped playing. You speak of the earth and the graves. You have shamed the moon, Vesa holomere. You have spat upon the gift that every woman in this kingdom prays for. You call me a tyrant? You have no idea what a tyrant looks like. But you will. He turned his back on her, a gesture of supreme dismissal that stung worse than a blow. He looked toward the high priestess and the assembled council, who were already whispering of execution by fire. Lucien's mind raced. He felt the bond pulsing, a raw, bleeding thing. He knew that if he handed her to the priestess, she would be dead before the moon set. And yet, the fury in him demanded a price that matched the magnitude of her insult. The law of the moonstone is ancient, Lucien declared, his voice carrying to the furthest reaches of the square. Rejection of a fated mate is a crime against the crown. Defiling the stone is a crime against the gods. Normally the pyre would be your end. But I will not make a martyr of a girl who hates me. I will let the world she loves so much claim her. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. The high priestess stepped forward. By king, the law is clear. She must be purged. I am the law, Lucien snapped, his eyes flashing with a brief, terrifying gold before returning to black. I invoke the wasteland decree. A collective gasp, more terrified than the first, erupted from the crowd. The wasteland decree was a relic of the old world, a sentence reserved for those whose crimes were so great that even death was considered too merciful. The prisoner would be stripped of all rank, all protection, and cast into the Howling Thorns, a sentient, magical forest on the border of the kingdom where the flora was as bloodthirsty as the fauna. No female had ever survived a single night there. It was not a sentence of survival. It was a sentence of prolonged, agonizing erasure. Vesa felt a cold shiver of relief wash over her, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The thorns. It was a death sentence, yes, but it was a death away from the city. It was a chance. The thorns. Vesa mocked, though her voice caught. You're too cowardly to kill me yourself, Ashwolf. You have to let the weeds do it for you. Lucien spun around, crossing the distance between them in a blur of motion. He grabbed her by the jaw, his fingers like iron talons. For a second the proximity was electric. The bond flared, a white-hot bridge between their spirits. For a fleeting moment Lucien saw through her mask. He saw the terror, the desperation, and a strange, flickering violet shadow in her eyes. But his pride was too wounded, his heart too shattered to listen. I am not sending you to the weeds, Vesa, he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. I am sending you to the truth. In the thorns there are no lies. No politics. No crowns. There is only what you are. And if you are as strong as your mouth suggests, perhaps you will see the sun again. But I doubt it. He shoved her back into the arms of the guards. Take her. Strip her of her house colors. Take her to the iron gate at the edge of the world. She is no longer a citizen of Ashfall. She is a ghost of the wasteland. As the guards dragged her away, Vesa didn't look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the blood moon, watching as the violet flame finally began to lick at the edges of her vision. She had shamed a king and invited a nightmare, all to protect a secret that was now the only thing keeping her heart beating. Behind her, Lucian stood alone on the dais, the most powerful man in the north, looking like a man who had just lost the only thing that ever truly mattered. The night of Howling Thorns had begun, and the kingdom of Ashfall would never be the same. Chapter 2. The transition from the world of men to the domain of the Howling Thorns was marked by a gate of rusted iron that looked more like the jagged teeth of a starving beast than a physical barrier. As the heavy chains rattled and the gate groaned open, the guards, men who had faced charging rogue wolves without flinching, refused to step even a foot beyond the threshold. They shoved Vesa forward with the butt of a spear, and she stumbled into the gray, choking mist that acted as the forest's breath. Behind her, the iron gate slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a death knell, leaving her alone in a silence so absolute it felt heavy. The thorns did not look like a forest of the living. They looked like a graveyard of ancient, spiteful things. The trees were skeletal, their bark as dark and hard as obsidian, and every inch of every branch was smothered in thick, pulsating vines covered in 3-inch needles. These needles were not static. They twitched, sensing the warmth of her blood, leaning toward her as she passed like iron filings toward a magnet. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sweet and rotting, a cloying perfume meant to mask the stench of the forest's previous victims. Vesa's first challenge was not the predators of the wood, but the environment itself. The ground was a treacherous carpet of moss-covered sinkholes and tangled roots that moved when she wasn't looking. Within the first hour, the mist turned into a freezing horizontal rain that soaked through her thin tunic, clinging to her skin like a shroud. The cold was a physical predator, gnawing at her fingers and toes, trying to lull her into the lethal sleep of hypothermia. Every time she felt her eyelids grow heavy, a vine would lash out, grazing her arm and drawing a thin line of blood that sizzled against the cold. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the inferno within. The void flame, agitated by the bond's distance and the sheer malice of the forest, was a wild animal trapped in a cage of ribs. It didn't just burn, it hungered. It wanted to consume the cold, to devour the mist, and to blast the howling thorns into ash. Every time Vesa's heart rate spiked, a surge of violet light would ripple beneath her skin, illuminating her veins like a map of a dying star. She had to clench her fists so hard her nails drew blood, focusing every ounce of her will on dampening the fire. If she let it slip, if even a single spark escaped, the High Priestess's trackers, surely lurking at the edge of the woods, would see the flare from miles away. She was a walking bomb trying to navigate a minefield. The sentient vines seemed to sense the unstable power within her. They didn't just reach for her, they whispered. A low, raspy sibilance filled the air, the sound of thousands of thorns rubbing together, mimicking the voices of those she had lost. Give in, the wind seemed to moan through the hollow trunks. Let the fire breathe. Let us drink the flame. The forest was a maze designed to break the mind. Paths appeared to open between the obsidian trunks, only to seal shut the moment she entered them, forcing her deeper into the lightless heart of the grove. The trees themselves shifted, their roots groaning like tectonic plates as they moved to intercept her. She found herself crawling through tunnels of thorns that left her clothes in ribbons and her skin a mosaic of shallow cuts. Each scratch felt like a tiny needle of ice being injected into her bloodstream, a numbing toxin that the thorns used to sedate their prey before the final embrace. As night fell, a true night where the moon was swallowed by the canopy, the elements turned savage. A localized blizzard erupted within the forest, the wind howling through the thorns with a sound like 1,000 dying wolves. Vesa found a hollowed-out log, its interior lined with the skeletal remains of a stag, and crawled inside. She curled into a ball, her teeth chattering so violently she feared they would shatter. This was the moment the void flame fought hardest. It offered her warmth. It offered her a sun in the palm of her hand. It showed her visions of Lucian's golden eyes, promising that if she just let the fire out, the king would have to come for her. He would have to see her. No, she whispered into the freezing dark, her breath a ghostly plume. I am Vesa Holomir. I do not burn for kings and I do not burn for gods. She focused on the rhythm of her heartbeat, slow and jagged. She visualized the violet fire as a small dying ember, piling the ash of her willpower over it to keep it contained. The struggle was a marathon of the soul. Outside, the thorns scratched at the wood of her hiding place, a persistent rhythmic tapping that sounded like fingers on a door. They were waiting for her to fail. They were waiting for her to freeze or to explode. But as the first gray light of a second day began to filter through the suffocating mist, Vesa was still breathing, scarred, shivering and starving, but the fire was still a secret and the girl was still a warrior. She crawled out of the log, her eyes hardening as she looked deeper into the green-black abyss. She wasn't just surviving the wasteland, she was learning its language, and the forest, for the first time in an eternity, seemed to recoil in a flicker of primitive fear. Chapter 3. The iron gate had remained closed for 36 hours, a silent, rusted sentinel marking the boundary between the living and the lost. On the hither side, the kingdom of Ashfall continued its cold, rhythmic existence, but its heart was beating out of sync. Alpha King Lucian Ashwolf stood on the battlements of the western watchtower, his silhouette a jagged notch against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. He had not slept. He had not shifted. He had barely breathed. The bond, that invisible celestial tether he had so desperately wanted to claim, was now a fraying wire of agony pulled taut across the miles. It didn't just thrum, it screamed. It felt like a low-voltage current being dragged through his marrow, vibrating with every panicked heartbeat of the woman he had sent to die. Every advisor in his court, every general in his army, and the high priestess herself had urged him to celebrate the purge of the Holomir heretic. To them the matter was settled, a public shame addressed by a lethal decree. But Lucian felt the lie in his chest. A fated bond did not react this way to a common criminal. The pull toward the howling thorns was becoming a physical gravity, a force that tilted his world until the only down was the dark, swirling mist of the wasteland. He could feel her cold. He could feel the rhythmic, jagged scratching of the thorns against her skin. Most of all, he could feel a strange, volatile heat emanating from her that made no sense in the freezing damp of the forest. Without a word to his guard, without a crown on his head or a cape on his back, Lucian descended the tower. He moved with the silent, lethal grace of a wolf who had already decided on his prey. When he reached the iron gate, the sentries scrambled to their feet, their eyes wide with terror. They saw the black void in their king's gaze and the way his hands were curled into claws, the skin over his knuckles white and bloodless. He didn't order them to open the gate. He simply stared at the lock until the lead guard fumbled the keys in his haste to obey. "My king, the decree states no one shall enter until the third son," the guard stammered, his voice cracking. "The thorns are hungry. They do not distinguish between the condemned and the crowned." "Then let them learn the taste of Ashwolf blood," Lucian growled, his voice a tectonic rumble. He stepped through the threshold, the rusted iron groaning behind him as the gate swung shut. The mist swallowed him instantly, a thick, cloying vapor that tried to invade his lungs. To any other man, the howling thorns were a maze of death, but Lucian was a predator of the highest order. He closed his eyes, ignoring the visual deception of the shifting trees, and focused entirely on the golden thread in his mind. It was frayed, scorched, and pulsing with a frantic rhythm. He began to run. The forest reacted to him differently than it had to Vesa. Where it had tried to entangle her, it now tried to challenge him. The sentient vines lashed out like whips, their 3-inch needles seeking the gaps in his leather armor. Lucian didn't dodge. He tore through them with his bare hands, the thorns drawing blood from his palms that smoked as it hit the ground. His wolf was near the surface, a massive, obsidian-furred beast that snarled in the back of his throat. He could smell her now. Underneath the scent of rotting vegetation and wet earth, there was the sharp metallic tang of Holomir blood and something else, something that smelled like a thunderstorm trapped in a jar. As he pushed deeper into the lightless heart of the grove, the air began to change. The freezing mist was being burned away, not by the sun but by a localized, unnatural heat. The trees here were scorched, their obsidian bark glowing a faint, sickly violet. Lucian slowed his pace, his instincts screaming of a danger he didn't recognize. He reached a clearing where the canopy had been completely incinerated, leaving a jagged hole that looked up at the indifferent stars. In the center of the clearing, Vesa was cornered. A night stalker, a creature of shadow and teeth that usually only haunted the deepest abysses of the north, was circling her. The beast was a mass of shifting darkness, 10 feet tall with eyes like dying coals. It lunged, its claws raking the air where Vesa had been a second before. She was exhausted, her tunic a rag of blood and soot, her face pale as a ghost's. Lucien prepared to leap, his muscles coiling for the shift, but he stopped when he saw Vesa's eyes. They weren't blue anymore. They were two pools of swirling, violent amethyst. "I told you," she rasped, her voice sounding like grinding stones. "I do not burn for kings." As the night stalker reared back for a killing blow, Vesa didn't scream. She didn't cower. She threw her hands forward and a torrent of violet flame erupted from her palms. This was not the silver fire of the goddess or the orange heat of a blacksmith's forge. It was a demon fire, the void flame. It didn't just burn the creature, it seemed to erase it. The darkness of the night stalker hissed and evaporated into nothingness, the very air screaming as the unnatural heat tore through the dimensions. The clearing was bathed in a terrifying, beautiful purple light that turned the shadows into jagged knives. Lucien stood frozen in the treeline, his heart hammering against his ribs. The shock was a physical weight. The heresy the high priestess had whispered about wasn't just a political slur. It was a reality. Vesa was a vessel for the void, a power that was the polar opposite of the moon's light. By the laws of his ancestors, he should have killed her where she stood. He should have ended the threat to his kingdom and his bloodline. But as the violet fire died down, Vesa collapsed into the soot, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the manifestation. The purple light faded from her eyes, leaving them dull and human again. She looked small. She looked broken. And the bond between them, instead of recoiling from the darkness, flared with a protective, possessive heat that nearly brought the king to his knees. He stepped out of the shadows, his boots crunching on the charred remains of the forest floor. Vesa didn't have the strength to stand. She rolled onto her back, looking up at him with a defiant, weary smile as he towered over her. "Did you come to watch me burn, Lucien?" she whispered, a thin trail of blood running from her nose. Lucien looked down at the woman he had sentenced to death, the woman who carried a power that could destroy his world. He looked at the scorched earth and the shattered thorns. Then he did something that the laws of Ashfall did not allow. He knelt in the soot, reached down and gathered her into his arms. The contact was an explosion, a collision of moon and void that made the forest itself groan in protest. "I came to see what you were hiding," Lucien said, his voice thick with a mixture of fury and unwanted reverence. "But I think I found something much more dangerous than a heretic." He pulled her against his chest, his wolf's heat fighting the chill of her skin. Vesa didn't fight him, she didn't have the strength left. As she spiraled into unconsciousness, she gripped the front of his tunic, her soot-stained fingers trembling. Lucien looked back toward the iron gate, then deeper into the thorns. He couldn't take her back to the city, not like this. Not with the high priestess waiting to see the violet in her veins. He would have to stay. He would have to hunt. He would have to protect the woman he was supposed to execute. And in the silence of the howling thorns, the Alpha King realized that his reign had ended, and his transformation had begun. Chapter 4. The cave was a shallow, jagged scar in the side of a basalt cliff, smelling of ancient wet stone and the ozone that still clung to Vesa's hair. Outside, the howling thorns were in a frenzy. The death of the Night Stalker had not sated the forest. It had acted as a dinner bell for every shadowborn horror lurking in the mist. Lucien sat by the mouth of the cave, his massive frame blocking the worst of the freezing wind. He watched Vesa as she drifted in the shallow, fitful sleep of the magically exhausted. Even in rest, she looked like she was fighting a war. Her brow was furrowed, and every few minutes her fingers would twitch, tracing phantom patterns in the air as if trying to weave the violet fire back into existence. Lucien's own wolf was pacing a narrow track in his mind, snarling at the conflicting instincts that were tearing the king apart. Half of him wanted to drag her back to Ashfall and demand she explain the heresy of the void flame. The other half, the primal bond-driven half, wanted to bury his face in her neck and never let the world touch her again. The bond was no longer a thread. It was a tether of white-hot iron. He could feel her hunger as a dull ache in his own stomach, her cold as a shiver in his own limbs. When she finally stirred, her eyes snapping open to reveal a lingering flicker of amethyst before settling into a wary blue, Lucien didn't move. He simply handed her a piece of dried venison he had kept in his scouting pouch. "Eat," he commanded, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the small cave. "The fire you used, it took more than just your energy. Took your life force. If you don't replace it, you'll be dead before the moon reaches its zenith." Vesa took the meat, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through both of them, a violent spark of moon and void that made Vesa gasp and pull away. "I don't need your charity, Lucien. You're the one who sent me here to die. Why haven't you finished the job? You saw what I am. I'm the monster the High Priestess warns the children about." "I saw a woman who killed a Night Stalker with her bare hands," Lucien countered, his golden eyes narrowing. "And I saw a mate who would rather burn her own soul to cinders than let me claim her. Tell me, Vesa, was it worth it? The pain of the thorns, the decree, the risk of the flame? All to keep me at arm's length." Vesa leaned back against the damp stone, a bitter laugh escaping her cracked lips. "You think this is about my pride? You think I shamed you because I find you distasteful? Lucien, the High Council executed my father not because he was a heretic, but because he found out what they were doing with the void. They are harvesting it. They are trying to create a weapon that can kill an Alpha King. If they saw the mark on my skin, they wouldn't just kill me, they'd use me as a battery for your assassination. I rejected you to save your life, you arrogant fool." The silence that followed was heavier than the basalt above them. Lucien stepped toward her, the space in the cave suddenly feeling much too small. He reached out, his hand hovering near her collarbone where the mark lay hidden beneath her tattered tunic. Before he could speak, the forest outside went dead silent. The wind stopped howling. The scratching of the thorns ceased. Then a sound came from the mist that made the marrow in Lucien's bones turn to ice. It was a high-pitched melodic trill, beautiful and terrifying, like 1,000 silver bells being shattered at once. "A frost siren," Lucien whispered, his body already beginning the agonizing half-shift into his battle form. His nails lengthened into obsidian claws and his canine teeth sharpened. "They hunt in pairs. They don't just eat the flesh, they consume the spirit through the bond." Vesa scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking. "I can't. I don't have enough left. The void is dormant. If I try to call it now, it will consume me before it touches them." "Then don't call the void," Lucien said, turning to face the cave entrance as two pale luminous shapes emerged from the gray mist. The sirens were beautiful in a way that defied nature. Skin like polished marble, wings made of jagged ice shards, and eyes that reflected the worst fears of those they looked upon. "Give me your hand, Vesa." "What?" "The bond." Lucien roared as the first siren lunged, its ice claws raking across his chest, shredding his leather armor and drawing blood that froze before it hit the floor. "It's a bridge. You have the void, I have the moon. Separately we are exhausted. Together, we are the eclipse." Vesa didn't hesitate. She reached out and gripped Lucien's hand, her fingers locking with his. The moment their palms met, the world exploded in a sensory overload. The bond, which had been a source of pain and friction, suddenly snapped into its true alignment. It was like a dam breaking. Lucien felt the icy, infinite depths of Vesa's void power pouring into him, and in return he gave her the searing, solar heat of the Alpha King's lineage. They weren't just two people fighting anymore. They were a singular, celestial event. The first siren shrieked as a wave of silver-violet energy radiated from the pair, shattering the ice on its wings. Lucien moved with a speed he had never possessed, his movements amplified by Vesa's spatial awareness. He lunged at the second siren, his claws wreathed in a strange, shimmering fire that was neither light nor dark, but a terrifying synthesis of both. He caught the creature by its throat, and where his touch landed, the siren's marble skin didn't just break, it evaporated. Vesa stood behind him, her eyes wide as she felt Lucien's strength flowing through her limbs. She wasn't just a passenger, she was the rudder. She directed the flow of their combined power, sensing the siren's movements before they happened. When the first siren tried to flank Lucien, Vesa raised her free hand, and a barrier of solidified shadow and moonlight snapped into existence, the creature's claws glancing off it like glass against diamond. "Now!" Vesa shouted, her voice echoing with a dual-tone resonance that shook the cave. Lucien released the full force of the bond. He didn't just strike, he obliterated. A blast of eclipse energy erupted from him, a pillar of silver and violet that tore through the clearing, incinerating the sirens and carving a path through the howling thorns that stretched for a mile. The sentient vines didn't just recoil. They turned to white ash, the forest itself screaming in a collective voice of primal terror at the presence of a power that predated the stars. As the echoes of the blast died down, the two remained locked together, their breathing synchronized, their hearts beating as one. The combined power slowly receded, leaving them both gasping for air, leaning against each other for support. The silence of the forest was different now. It was respectful. The predators had seen what happened when the king and the pariah stopped fighting each other and started fighting the world. Lucien looked down at Vesa, his golden eyes flecked with permanent traces of violet. He didn't pull away. He couldn't. The forced alliance had revealed a truth more dangerous than any heresy. Together they were unstoppable. "You saved my life," Vesa whispered, her head resting against his chest. "We saved each other," Lucien corrected, his voice raspy and raw. He tilted her chin up, looking at the woman he had tried to exile. "The High Council wants a weapon, Vesa? Let them have one. We are going back to Ashfall. And this time it won't be as prisoner and king. It will be as the storm that breaks them." Vesa looked into his eyes, and for the first time since the moon-gazing ceremony, she didn't see a tyrant. He saw a partner. The bond hummed between them, no longer a source of shame but a promise of vengeance. The howling thorns were still dark and the night was still cold, but as they stood in the ruins of the clearing, the first dawn of a new world began to bleed over the horizon. Chapter 5. The aftermath of the eclipse blast left a corridor of absolute desolation through the howling thorns, a blackened scar where the sentient vegetation had been reduced to fine white ash. Within this vacuum of silence, Lucien and Vesa moved with a newfound haunting synchronicity. The bond was no longer a frantic alarm. It had settled into a steady low-frequency hum that allowed Lucien to feel the exact moment Vesa's strength began to flag, and allowed her to sense the hypervigilance radiating from his skin. They were no longer predator and prey, nor king and prisoner. They were two halves of a fractured celestial event, walking through a graveyard of their own making. As they pushed deeper toward the western edge of the thorns, the natural architecture of the forest began to change. The obsidian trees gave way to a series of jagged ravines, the earth here stained a sickly sulphurous yellow. Lucien came to a dead stop, his hand snapping out to catch Vesa's shoulder. His nostrils flared, the obsidian wolf beneath his skin letting out a low, vibrating growl of warning. The scent on the wind wasn't the rot of the forest or the ozone of the void. It was the smell of cold steel, expensive tobacco, and a very specific type of wolfbane incense used only by the elite hunters of the Ashfall High Council. "Get down," Lucien whispered, his voice barely a breath. He didn't wait for her to comply, drawing her into the shadow of a basalt overhang. 100 yards ahead, nestled in the mouth of a natural basin, was a camp that had no business existing within the wasteland. It was a tactical installation of silver-trimmed tents, fortified with runic stakes that hummed with a repulsive anti-magic frequency. These weren't the tents of refugees or explorers. They were the mobile command centers of the Silverclaw Sentinels, the High Council's private executioners. Vesa's breath hitched as she peered over the ridge. "Those are the Council's colors. Why are they here?" The decree stated that the wasteland was off-limits until the third dawn. Even the King's Guard isn't allowed to cross the Iron Gate. "They aren't here to enforce the decree," Lucien said, his eyes darkening into a lethal obsidian black. "They're here to ensure it's carried out. And they aren't just looking for you." They moved like ghosts, descending the ridge with a silence born of shared intent. As they neared the perimeter, the sound of voices drifted through the sulphurous air, cold, clinical voices discussing the mechanics of murder. They reached the rear of the largest tent, where the heavy canvas was pinned down by iron crates marked with the seal of the High Priestess. With a flick of his claw, Lucien sliced a thin opening in the fabric, allowing them to see inside. Standing over a map of the Howling Thorns was Commander Varric, the High Council's most loyal hound. He was flanked by 3 mages wearing the crimson robes of the temple. On the table before them lay a series of silver canisters, identical to the ones Vessa's father had once described. Vessels designed to siphon and stabilize void energy. The king has been missing from the battlements for 12 hours, Varric said, his voice devoid of emotion. The bond must have pulled him in. This is an unforeseen variable but an advantageous one. If the Alpha King dies in the Thorns alongside the Hollowmere girl, the council assumes regency immediately. We don't just kill her, we frame her for his assassination. A heretic killing a king. The people will scream for the high priestess to take the throne. One of the mages tapped a spot on the map, precisely where Vessa and Lucien had fought the frost sirens. The energy spike we detected was off the charts. It wasn't just the void. It was a synthesis. If they've successfully bonded, the decree won't kill them. We need to deploy the Void Eaters. We cannot risk them reaching the border. Vessa felt the blood drain from her face. The Void Eaters were legendary horrors, constructs of iron and dark magic designed to consume the life force of anyone wielding non-traditional power. The High Council wasn't just waiting for her to die. They had turned the wasteland into a laboratory for regicide. Look at the crates, Vessa whispered, pointing to the open iron boxes near the commander's feet. Lucien followed her gaze and felt a fury so cold it threatened to freeze the blood in his veins. Inside the crates were scrolls, official royal proclamations, already signed with the High Priestess's seal and a forged version of Lucien's own signet. They were death warrants for every remaining member of the Hollowmere line and the loyalist pack leaders who had supported Lucien's father. The betrayal was absolute. The council had used Vessa's shame as the spark to ignite a coup that had been decades in the making. They didn't just want you dead, Vessa, Lucien said, his voice a low, terrifying hum of power. They wanted to use your death to erase everything I've built. They turned my own law, my own decree, into a noose for my neck. We can't take them all, Vessa noted, her eyes scanning the dozen sentinels patrolling the camp. Not while the runic stakes are active. They're dampening the bond, Lucien. I can feel the connection fraying. Then we don't fight them here, Lucien said, his gaze fixed on the silver canisters of void energy. We take the evidence. If we can get those canisters and the forged warrants back to the border, the loyalist packs will have the proof they need to turn on the council. Before they could retreat, a horn blasted from the center of the camp, a jagged, discordant sound that signaled the detection of an intruder. The runic stakes began to glow with a sickly green light, and the ground beneath them began to vibrate. The Void Eaters, Vessa gasped as the earth at the edge of the camp tore open. For massive, mechanical monstrosities emerged from the dirt. They were shells of rusted iron in the shape of eyeless wolves, their hollow interiors glowing with a captured, agitated violet flame. They didn't scent the air, they scented the power. They turned as one toward the basalt overhang where Vessa and Lucien were hidden, their metal jaws unhinging to release a sound like grinding tectonic plates. Run, Lucien commanded, grabbing Vessa's hand. They bolted from the shadows, but they weren't running away from the camp. They were running through it. Lucien shifted mid-stride, his body exploding into the massive obsidian-furred wolf of the Ash Wolf line. He didn't stop to fight the sentinels. He became a wrecking ball, smashing through the silver-trimmed tents and scattering the mages. Vessa, riding the surge of adrenaline and the remnants of the eclipse energy, dove for the command table. She scooped up the forged warrants and a handful of the silver canisters, stuffing them into her satchel even as the first Void Eater lunged at her. The iron beast's jaws snapped inches from her face, the vacuum of its interior trying to pull the fire from her veins. Lucien's wolf form intercepted the monster, his claws shrieking against its metal hide. The dampening field of the runic stakes made the bond feel like a whisper in a hurricane, but the shared fury between them acted as its own catalyst. The stakes. Lucien's voice echoed in Vessa's mind, a primal telepathy triggered by the proximity of death. Destroy the stakes. Vessa saw the central runic pillar, a massive obsidian spike engraved with glowing green geometry. She didn't have the void flame to blast it, but she had something else. She pulled one of the captured void canisters, twisted the release valve and hurled it at the base of the pillar. Cover your eyes, she screamed. The explosion wasn't loud. It was a silent, gravitational collapse. The concentrated void energy inside the canister reacted violently with the anti-magic field of the stake. For a split second, a miniature black hole formed in the center of the camp, sucking the light, the tense and the green runic glow into a single point of nothingness. Then the pressure reversed. A shock wave of pure, unfiltered void energy blasted outward, shattering the mechanical wolves and sending the sentinels flying like autumn leaves. The dampening field vanished. The bond between Lucien and Vesa snapped back into full, agonizing clarity, surging with a power that made the sulphurous sky turn a bruised, electric purple. In the chaos, Lucien shifted back into his human form, his skin smoking from the contact with the iron monsters. He grabbed Vesa, shielding her from the falling debris of the camp. Commander Varric was struggling to his feet, reaching for a silver crossbow, but Lucien didn't give him the chance. He let out a roar that wasn't human or wolf, but something ancient, the voice of a king who had seen the face of his betrayers. The sound alone was enough to paralyze the remaining sentinels. Lucien and Vesa didn't stay to finish the slaughter. They had what they needed. They vanished back into the mist of the howling thorns, the evidence of the council's treason clutched in Vesa's hand. As they paused a mile away, deep within the obsidian shadows of the forest, Vesa looked at the forged death warrants in her hand. Her name was there, but so was her father's, dated years ago. And Lucien's name was at the top of the Regency purge list. They were never going to let either of us walk out of here, she whispered, her voice trembling. Lucien looked back toward the smoldering ruins of the camp, his face a mask of cold, calculated vengeance. They made one mistake, Vesa. They thought the wasteland would break us. They didn't realize it would forge us. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the golden-violet fire in his eyes was no longer a sign of a curse, but a herald of a revolution. We aren't going back to Ashfall to ask for justice. We're going back to burn the council to the ground. Vesa gripped his hand, the void and the moon humming in perfect, lethal harmony. The council's betrayal had been intended to end the Hollowmere line and the Ashwolf reign, but instead, it had given the kingdom of Ashfall something far more terrifying. A king and a queen who no longer believed in mercy. The howling thorns were behind them, but the real war was just beginning. Chapter 6. The descent into the silent graves felt like walking backward through time into a nightmare that Ashfall had spent a decade trying to forget. The district was a jagged canyon of crumbling stone and soot-choked alleys, nestled deep in the shadow of the mountain upon which the king's palace sat like a crown of ice. Here the air was different, heavy with the metallic tang of old blood and the persistent weeping moisture of the earth. Lucien, still radiating the raw, restless power of the eclipse, moved through the ruins with his head held high, though his golden eyes flickered with a growing sense of horror. To him, the silent graves had always been a map coordinate, a site of a long-past rebellion that had required a firm hand to settle. To Vesa, every cracked cobblestone was a headstone. They moved past rows of tenements that looked like skeletal rib cages, their windows boarded up with rotted timber. Vesa didn't stop at the surface. She led him toward the great ossuary, a subterranean network of tombs that had once housed the honored ancestors of the Hollowmere line before they were branded heretics. As they descended the spiraling stone stairs, the temperature plummeted. The bond between them flared, Vesa's internal fire acting as a torch that illuminated the walls. Lucien's breath hitched. The walls weren't just stone. They were engraved with sprawling, frantic runes that had been gouged into the rock with fingernails and blunt tools. They didn't just execute the rebels here, Lucien, Vesa said, her voice a hollow echo in the damp dark. They didn't just put down a riot. They harvested us. She stopped before a massive iron door, the seal of the Ashfall High Council burned into the center. It was a door Lucien recognized. A restricted research vault he had been told was used for stabilizing the kingdom's ley lines. With a surge of violet-tinted strength, Vesa didn't wait for a key. She placed her hand on the lock and let the void flame hiss through the tumblers. The metal shrieked and gave way, swinging open to reveal a chamber that turned the Alpha King's stomach. The room was a laboratory of horrors. Glass vats, cracked and filled with stagnant green preservative, lined the walls. Inside weren't specimens of plants or animals, but the preserved remains of wolves, Hollowmere wolves. Their bodies were riddled with silver conduits, wires of pure moon metal threaded through their spinal columns and into their brains. On the central stone tables lay leather restraints stained with decades of salt and sorrow. Lucien stepped toward a desk covered in meticulous journals. He opened one, the parchment brittle under his touch. His eyes scanned the handwriting, It belonged to High Counselor Malphas, his most trusted advisor. The entries were dated from the year of his coronation to the present week. Subject 42 showing high resistance to lunar integration. Void flame siphoned at 12% efficiency before the host expired. Recommendation: increase the pressure on the Silent Graves district to find younger, more volatile vessels. My father. He told me the Holomirs were trying to steal the throne, Lucien whispered, the journal shaking in his hand. He told me the Silent Graves was a quarantine zone for a blood plague. The only plague here was ambition, Vesa spat, her eyes glowing with a fierce morning light. She walked to the back of the room and pulled aside a heavy velvet curtain. Behind it lay a series of silver canisters, identical to the ones they had stolen from the camp in the Thorns, but these were connected to a massive pulsating machine that looked like a mechanical heart. This is how they've been maintaining the eternal winter that protects Ashfall. They aren't using the goddess's grace. They're using the siphoned souls of my people processed through the void to power the kingdom's defenses. Your peace, Lucien, is built on a foundation of screaming ghosts. Lucien felt the bond buckle under the weight of the revelation. The pride he felt in his lineage, the honor he associated with the Ashwolf name, was suddenly a shroud of filth. He looked at the vats, seeing the faces of men and women who shared Vesa's features. The same high cheekbones, the same defiant set of the jaw. He realized then that Vesa hadn't just shamed him to save herself. She had shamed him because he was the face of a regime that had turned her family into fuel. I didn't know, he rasped, turning to her, his heart breaking in the violet light. Vesa, I swear by the moon and the stars I did not know. Ignorance is a luxury for kings, Lucien, Vesa replied, though her voice softened as she saw the genuine agony in his eyes. She stepped closer, placing a hand over the bond mark on his chest. The council kept you on the battlements, focused on the borders and the wars, while they hollowed out the heart of your city. They made you their ultimate weapon while they built a better one in the dark. She led him further into the vault, to a final, secluded alcove. There, atop a velvet cushion, sat a crown, not of gold or silver but of solidified void shadow. It hummed with a frequency that made the very air in the tomb vibrate. Beside it lay a ledger of names, the harvest list. Lucien's finger traced the most recent entry, dated the day of the moon-gazing ceremony. Subject: Vesa Holomir. Status: fate bonded to the king. Action: trigger rejection protocol to initiate wasteland decree. Objective: capture in the Thorns for final extraction to the Shadow Crown. The betrayal was complete. The council had never intended for the bond to succeed. They had engineered the humiliation, knowing Lucien's pride would lead him to invoke the decree, which would deliver Vesa, the most powerful void vessel in history, directly into their hands in the wilderness, away from public eyes. Lucien looked at the crown and then at Vesa. The golden light of his alpha spirit flared, merging with the violet aura she emitted until the entire tomb was bathed in the shimmering, bruised color of a solar eclipse. The truth was no longer a secret. It was a call to war. They wanted a weapon, Lucien said, his voice dropping an octave into the territory of the divine. He reached out and gripped Vesa's hand, their fingers interlocking. They wanted to harvest the void to control the moon. But they forgot one thing. What's that? Vesa asked. A king is nothing without his people, Lucien said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that promised fire. And a moon is nothing without the darkness to give it light. We are taking this evidence, Vesa. Every vat, every ledger, every drop of blood. We aren't just going to stop them. We are going to show the people of Ashfall exactly what kind of peace they've been living in. The bond, once a source of terror and shame, now felt like a conduit of pure, righteous vengeance. As they prepared to leave the Silent Graves, Lucien looked back one last time at the laboratory of his ancestors' sins. He knew that by the time the sun rose, the High Council would realize their trackers had failed and their secrets were out. But as he walked beside Vesa Holomir, no longer a pariah but the living soul of a revolution, the Alpha King felt a cold, sharp joy. The hunt was over. The uprising had begun. Chapter 7. The transition from the cold, clinical horror of the laboratory to the relative safety of the upper tunnels was marked by a heavy, mutual silence that felt like the eye of a storm. Lucien led the way, his stride no longer the arrogant march of an alpha, but the cautious movement of a man navigating a world he no longer recognized. Behind him, Vesa clutched the ledger of the harvested to her chest as if it were a holy relic. The bond between them, once a source of jagged friction, had smoothed into a deep, echoing resonance. Every time her foot slipped on a wet stone, he felt the lurch in his own heart. Every time he scanned a dark corner for sentinels, she felt the predatory spike in his adrenaline. They were no longer two strangers tethered by fate. They were two survivors fused by a common trauma. When they reached the Whispering Vault, a secluded chamber high above the silent graves where the wind from the peaks whistled through narrow vents, Lucien finally stopped. He turned to face her, the moonlight from a high, barred window catching the silver and violet flecks in his eyes. The regal mask he had worn for years was gone, shattered by the vats of preserved kin and the forged death warrants. He looked at Vesa, seeing not the heretic who had spat on his traditions, but the girl who had spent a decade carrying the weight of a dying district on her shoulders while he played at war on the borders. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice a low, raw rasp that broke the silence of the vault. "During the ceremony when the light struck, you could have whispered it. You could have shown me the mark. I would have protected you." Vesa leaned against the cold stone wall, a weary, sad smile touching her lips. "Protected me? Lucien, you were surrounded by the very men who signed my father's execution. Counselor Malphas was standing 3 feet to your left. The High Priestess was holding the ritual blade. If I had reached for you, if I had whispered the truth, they wouldn't have just killed me. They would have used the bond to infect you. The void flame is volatile, Lucien. If it had touched your lunar light while you were unprepared, the feedback would have leveled the Great Plaza. I didn't shame you to hurt you. I shamed you so that you would hate me enough to stay away. I needed you to be the king who sentenced me, not the mate who died with me." The revelation hit Lucien with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the sting of her spit on the moonstone, the way his pride had flared into a murderous white heat. He had thought her a monster of ego and rebellion. Instead, she had been a martyr of silence. She had chosen to be the villain in his story to ensure he lived to tell it. The shame he had carried like a lead weight in his soul was actually the greatest act of devotion he had ever received. "You threw away your life," Lucien whispered, stepping into her space. "You let me cast you into the thorns. You let the whole kingdom call you a traitor, just to keep my hands clean." "I don't care about the kingdom's opinion, Lucien," Vesa said, her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. "And I don't care about my life. I cared about the only person who had the power to actually fix this. If I died in the thorns, it was just another death in the graves. But if you died, Ashfall would fall into the void forever. I chose the kingdom over myself. I thought that was what kings were supposed to appreciate." Lucien didn't answer with words. He reached out, his hand trembling as he traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing over a small scar she had earned in the wasteland. The bond erupted at the contact. No longer a scream of agony, but a symphony of recognition. It was a golden-violet tide that swept through both of them, washing away the cynicism, the fear, and the decade of lies. For the first time, the Alpha King didn't fight the pull. He leaned into it, allowing his soul to fully dock with hers. The air in the Whispering Vault began to shimmer. The frost on the walls melted and turned to steam as their energies finally synchronized. The moon's light and the void's shadow didn't fight for dominance. They danced, swirling around the pair in a protective cocoon of eclipse energy. Vesa gasped, her head falling back as the pressure of the void flame, the fire that had threatened to consume her for years, finally found its anchor. In Lucien's lunar strength, the flame found a hearth. In Vesa's darkness, the king found his depth. "I spent my life thinking the moon was all I needed," Lucien murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "They taught us that the shadow was the enemy, that the void was the end of all things. But they were wrong. The light is blinding without the shade to give it shape. You aren't my shame, Vesa. You are my clarity." Vesa's hands came up to clutch his tunics, her fingers knotting in the fabric. The cynical walls she had built around her heart, the belief that all alphas were tyrants and all kings were puppets, crumbled into ash. She felt his grief for the graves, his fury at the council, and his absolute, unwavering vow to her. It was a vulnerability she hadn't known a man of his stature could possess. "The chaos isn't over," she whispered, her voice trembling as the bond fully fused. "The council knows we've escaped the thorns. They'll have the sentinels at every gate. They'll tell the people we've been corrupted. They'll call us the end of the world. Let them, Lucien said, his eyes snapping open to reveal pupils rimmed with a crown of violet fire. He looked toward the palace above them, the silhouette of the high priestess's spire visible through the bars. They wanted a weapon and they got one. They just didn't realize it would have two hearts and one soul. We aren't hiding anymore, Vesa. We aren't the secrets of the silent graves or the prisoners of the wasteland decree. He tilted her face up, his gaze locking onto hers with a terrifying, beautiful promise. The bond was complete. The silence was broken. In the heart of the cursed district, surrounded by the ghosts of the harvested and the ruins of a century of lies, the Alpha King and the Pariah Queen finally accepted what the goddess had known from the start. Tonight, Lucien declared, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 years of Ashwolf kings, we don't just survive. We take back the throne. And if the kingdom has to burn to be purified, then we will be the ones who hold the torch. Vesa didn't pull away. She leaned in, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted of soot, salt, and revolution. It was the final seal on the bond. A promise made in the dark that would change the face of the light forever. Outside, the wind howled through the silent graves, but for the first time in a decade, it didn't sound like a lament. It sounded like a battle cry. The king and his mate were united, and the High Council of Ashfall had no idea that the eclipse they had feared was already standing at their door. Chapter 8. The sky over Ashfall did not break into dawn. It curdled into a bruised, unnatural violet that mirrored the storm brewing in the lungs of the city. The capital was a hive of forced celebration and jagged, underlying terror. Every spire of the Alpha's palace was draped in the crimson banners of the High Council, the Ashwolf sigil of the obsidian wolf noticeably absent, replaced by the jagged, silver-clawed sun of the High Priestess. In the great plaza where Vesa had once spat upon the moonstone, a new stage had been erected. The council had not wasted time. With the king declared lost to the madness of the thorns, and the Hollowmere heretic presumed shredded by the sentient forest, the transition of power was being framed as a divine necessity. Councillor Malphas stood at the center of the dais, his robes heavy with the stolen authority of a regency. Beside him, the high priestess held a new crown, not the shadow crown they had hidden in the graves, but a sanitized gold replica meant to pacify the masses. The lineage of Ashwolf has failed us, Malphas's voice boomed, amplified by the amplification runes carved into the stage. Lucien Ashwolf abandoned his post, lured into the darkness by the very heretic he was meant to judge. He has chosen the void over the moon. Today we heal the fracture. Today we name a new protector. But the atmosphere was not one of jubilation. The people of Ashfall, the common pack members, the blacksmiths, the laborers of the silent graves, stood in a dense, silent block. They felt the wrongness in the air. The bond that connected a pack to its alpha was like a severed limb. They felt the phantom itch of Lucien's presence, a ghost signal that refused to go quiet. At the northern edge of the plaza, the massive iron gates that guarded the inner sanctum did not open. They dissolved. A blast of pure, concentrated eclipse energy, a shimmering blend of lunar silver and void violet, hit the gates with the force of a falling moon. The iron didn't just bend. It turned to vapor, the shockwave knocking the armored sentinels into the air like dry leaves. Out of the settling dust and the ionized air, two figures emerged. They did not come as fugitives. They came as a singular, catastrophic reckoning. Lucien Ashwolf walked with a stride that made the very foundations of the city tremble. He was stripped of his royal finery, wearing only the scarred leather and soot-stained furs of the wasteland, but he had never looked more like a king. Beside him, Vesa Hollowmere moved with the lethal grace of a shadow-given form. Her hand was locked in his, and where their skin met, a constant pulsating aura of bruised light rippled outward, crackling with the sound of 1,000 snapping sparks. The silence that fell over the plaza was more deafening than the explosion. The commoners began to part not out of command but out of a primal cellular recognition of the power walking toward them. "The king," someone whispered, the word spreading through the crowd like a wildfire in a drought. "The king is alive. And he didn't come back alone," another added, eyes fixed on Vesa. Lucien didn't stop until he reached the foot of the dais. He looked up at Malphas, his golden eyes rimmed with a permanent, glowing violet ring that signaled the completion of the bond. The councillors recoiled, their faces pale masks of disbelief. They had sent Void Eaters. They had sent the Silverclaw Sentinels. They had sent the Howling Thorns themselves. And yet, here stood the man they had tried to erase, holding the hand of the woman who was supposed to be his ruin. The Regency is over, Malphas. Lucien's voice didn't need runes to carry. It was the voice of the mountain, the voice of the pack, the voice of a man who had seen the bottom of the graves and returned with fire in his veins. Step down from my father's stage before I make it your scaffold. He is corrupted, the high priestess shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed at the violet light emanating from Vesa. Look at the stain on his soul. He has brought the void into our sanctuary. Sentinels, kill the heretics. Protect the moon. The Silverclaw Sentinels, the Council's elite guard, hesitated for a heartbeat. They were sworn to the crown, and the man standing before them wore the face of the only crown they had ever known. But the mages behind the priestess began to chant, their hands glowing with the sickly green light of the anti-magic dampeners. The mechanical Void Eaters, repaired and hungry, lambered out from the palace shadows, their iron joints screeching. You speak of protecting the moon? Vesa stepped forward, her voice ringing with a dual-tone resonance that made the glass windows of the surrounding tenements vibrate. She raised her free hand, the satchel at her side bursting open as the forged death warrants and the journals of Counselor Malphas flew into the air, suspended by her will. You speak of sanctuary while you build it on the bones of your own people? Look at the truth of your peace. With a flick of her fingers, the pages of the journals expanded, the text projected into the air by the violet fire for all to see. The crowd gasped as the diagrams of the siphoning vats, the lists of the harvested, and the plan for the king's assassination were laid bare in the light of day. The murmurs of the crowd turned into a low, dangerous growl. The people of the silent graves, hidden among the commoners, recognized the names. They recognized the dates. Lies. Malphas roared, gesturing for the mages to strike. A heretic's trick. The mages unleashed a barrage of lunar bolts, silver spears of energy meant to pierce and paralyze. Lucien didn't even raise a shield. He squeezed Vesa's hand and the bond did the rest. A dome of eclipse energy snapped into existence around them, the silver spears hitting the violet surface and simply being absorbed, fueled back into the pair's own reservoir. High turn, Lucien growled. He didn't shift into a wolf. He didn't need to. He lunged forward with the speed of a lightning strike, his fist wreathed in the combined power of the moon and the void. He struck the base of the dais and the entire structure groaned and collapsed, sending the counselors sprawling into the dirt. The sentinels moved to intervene, but the crowd, the thousands of citizens who had seen the evidence of the harvest, surged forward. They didn't need a king's command to protect their own. They fell upon the sentinels with the fury of a decade of suppressed grief. Vesa turned her attention to the Void Eaters. The mechanical beasts lunged at her, their hollow interiors trying to suck the fire from her spirit. But Vesa was no longer the frightened girl trying to suppress her nature. She was the anchor. She reached out and grabbed the lead monster by its iron jaw, her violet flame turning white-hot. You want the void? She whispered to the machine. Then take it all. She flooded the construct with more power than its silver conduits could handle. The Void Eater didn't just break. It detonated from the inside out, its iron shell melting into a pool of useless slag. She moved through the remaining constructs like a whirlwind of shadow and light, her movements synchronized perfectly with Lucien's as he cleared the path to the High Priestess. They met at the center of the ruins of the dais. Malphas was crawling toward the shadow of the palace, but Lucien's boot landed on his chest, pinning him to the ground. The High Priestess stood frozen, the golden crown trembling in her hands. The people saw the list, Malphas, Lucien said, his voice cold enough to freeze the air. They saw your handwriting. They saw the vats. The kingdom needed the power. Malphas gasped, blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. The winter. The defenses. We did it for Ashfall. You did it for yourselves, Vesa said, standing beside Lucien. The violet fire in her eyes was no longer a sign of a curse. It was a beacon. She looked out at the crowd, at the thousands of wolves who were now looking at her not with fear, but with a burgeoning, desperate hope. There is no peace without truth. There is no moon without the night. The High Priestess let out a final desperate cry and tried to plunge the ritual blade into her own heart, a final act of spite to deny them their justice. But the shadow moved faster. Vessa's void power wrapped around the priestess's wrist, freezing her in place. Lucien looked at the woman who had spent her life preaching the purity of the moon while harvesting the souls of the impure. He reached out and took the golden crown from her numb fingers. He didn't put it on his own head. He turned to the crowd, raising the crown high for everyone to see. The old law is dead. Lucien's voice echoed across the plaza, reaching into the deepest alleys of the silent graves and the highest towers of the nobility. The regency is over. The harvest is over. Today Ashfall stops living in the shadow of a lie. With a single effortless motion, Lucien crushed the golden crown in his hand, the metal shrieking as it was reduced to a twisted lump of ore. He threw it at the feet of the falling counselors. The roar that went up from the people of Ashfall was not the sound of a pack following a master. It was the sound of a city waking up. The sentinels threw down their spears. The mages fled into the shadows of the palace. The return of the outcast was complete, but as Vessa and Lucien stood amidst the ruins of the old world, their hands still locked together, they knew the hardest part was yet to come. They hadn't just reclaimed a throne, they had ignited a revolution. The violet sky above was no longer an omen of doom, it was the color of the new world they were about to build. Chapter 9. The dust of the collapsed dais had not yet settled when the air began to scream. It was a sound beyond the human or the lupin, a high-frequency vibration that rattled the very teeth of the thousands gathered in the great plaza. The high priestess, stripped of her golden crown and her dignity, stood at the center of the ruins like a broken gargoyle. But as Lucien's hand tightened around the evidence of her crimes, her desperation curdled into a final, suicidal fanaticism. She did not reach for mercy, she reached for the sky. Her eyes rolled back into her head, turning a terrifying milky white, and the ground beneath Ashfall began to groan. "You think you can rule with a stain on your soul?" she shrieked, her voice amplified by the dying embers of the temple's magic. "If the moon will not be pure, then there shall be no moon. I call upon the deep. I call upon the end." She didn't just tap into the void, she threw herself into it. The high priestess had spent decades siphoning the energy of the Hollowmere line, and now she broke every seal, every containment vessel within the palace. A pillar of raw, unrefined darkness erupted from the center of the royal spire, tearing through the roof and lashing out at the sky like a colossal ink-black serpent. This wasn't the controlled, sentient fire that Vessa carried. This was a hungry, mindless vacuum. It began to leach the color from the world. The crimson banners turned to gray, the golden sunlight was sucked into a pinprick of nothingness, and the people of Ashfall began to fall to their knees, their life force being tugged toward the vortex. Lucien lunged for the priestess, his obsidian wolf roaring within him, but he was repelled by an invisible wall of sheer gravity. The bond between him and Vessa, usually a source of strength, began to pull at his marrow with a terrifying intensity. He looked at Vessa and saw her vibrating, her skin becoming translucent as the violet flame within her reacted to the monstrous siren call of the palace vortex. "Vessa, don't!" Lucien shouted, reaching for her hand, but she was already drifting away from him, her feet barely touching the scorched marble. "She's opening the gate, Lucien," Vessa whispered, her voice echoing with the resonance of 1,000 ancestors. "She doesn't know how to close it. If I don't go in, she'll pull the entire kingdom into the void to spite us." Vessa looked at him one last time, not as a pariah, not as a fugitive, but as the other half of a celestial whole. She saw the terror in his golden eyes, the king who had just found his heart only to watch it walk into a hurricane. She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his for a fleeting second, the heat of their bond flare bright against the encroaching dark. "Trust me," she breathed. "I am not the girl you sentenced to die. I am the reason the fire was born." She turned and ran toward the vortex, her body igniting. This was no longer a flicker of violet. It was a conflagration. As she approached the high priestess, Vessa didn't fight the darkness, she embraced it. She stepped into the pillar of shadow, and for a moment the world went silent. Within the eye of the storm, Vessa faced the corrupted priestess. The old woman was being disintegrated by the very power she had sought to steal, her flesh flaking away into ash. "You cannot control it," the priestess cackled, her voice a hollow wind. "It is the end of all things." "No," Vessa said, her voice steady and cold. "It is the beginning." Vessa reached deep into the center of her own spirit, past the trauma of the silent graves, past the cold of the howling thorns, to the ancient primordial spark of the void flame. She realized then that the fire wasn't a curse of the demon-born. It was the shadow cast by the goddess herself, the necessary darkness that allowed the stars to shine. She stopped trying to contain the flame. She let the void expand until she was the center of the universe. The violet fire surged outward not to burn but to weave. It met the mindless hunger of the priestess's vortex and gave it shape. It gave it a heart. Vessa's power wrapped around the corruption, purifying the siphoned souls of her ancestors, releasing the screaming ghosts from their silver canisters. A wave of shimmering amethyst light washed over the palace, neutralizing the gravity well. The high priestess let out one final silent scream before she was simply erased. Not killed but unmade, her atoms scattered into the infinite dark she had tried to weaponize. As the vortex collapsed, Vessa stood alone in the air, a crown of violet flame hovering inches above her brow. The sky didn't return to the pale blue of morning. It remained a deep, majestic indigo, the stars visible even in the daytime, glowing with a new vibrant silver. She descended slowly, her feet touching the ruins of the dais where Lucien stood waiting. The Alpha King didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance and pulled her into a fierce, crushing embrace. The contact was no longer a collision of opposites. It was a perfect, humming harmony. The moon and the void had found their equilibrium. "The Void Queen," Lucien murmured, his voice thick with awe and relief. Vessa looked out at the great plaza. The people were standing again, looking up at the two of them. The fear was gone. In its place was a profound, hushed reverence. The wolves of Ashfall, who had been taught for centuries to fear the dark, now saw the beauty of the twilight. "Not just a queen," Vessa said, looking back at the silent graves, where the soot was finally beginning to clear. "A new era." Lucien turned to his people, his hand locked in Vessa's. "The law of the moon-gazing ceremony was that the goddess chose our mates. But today we choose our future. There will be no more harvests. There will be no more silent graves. Ashfall will be a kingdom of light and shadow, where the flame and the frost walk as one." The roar that went up from the crowd was a sound that would be remembered for 1,000 years. It was the sound of a pack finally made whole. As the days turned into weeks, the reconstruction of Ashfall began. The siphoning vats were destroyed, replaced by a new system of magical integration that allowed the Voidborn and the Moonbound to share their energies freely. The Howling Thorns were no longer a place of execution, but a guarded wildland where the young could learn the true nature of the world. In the high balcony of the palace, beneath a moon that now shone with a faint violet ring of protection, Vessa and Lucien stood together. They were no longer the king and the pariah who had shamed him. They were the architects of an eclipse, a permanent, beautiful union of two souls that had been tested by fire and ice. "They'll still talk about the night you spat on the moonstone," Lucien said with a touch of his old wolfish wit, his arm draped around her waist. Vessa leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Let them talk. It was the best decision I ever made." "And the decree?" Lucien asked, his voice softening. "The night of the howling thorns?" Vessa looked at the scars on her arms, then at the man who had followed her into the dark to find her. "The thorns gave me the truth, Lucien. And the truth gave me you." As the indigo night settled over the kingdom of Ashfall, the wolves began to howl, not in terror but in a long melodic song of peace. The era of the Void Queen and the Alpha King had begun, and for the first time in the history of the North, the shadows were no longer a place to hide. They were home. Thank you for watching this story. Please tell me in the comments section where you are watching from. Don't forget to like, share this story and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories like this every day. Thank you and God bless you. Amen.